morning. Thank you for that introduction, Caleb. That was very sweet. Thank you. We attended Grace Bible Church. I recognize many of you. We attended here for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years or something. And then we took a ministry in Fort Myers, a Messianic synagogue in Fort Myers, and that's our primary ministry. So occasionally you'll hear somebody call me Rabbi or Rabbi Scott. You can call me whatever you like. Many people do. It's okay. Text today is going to be Proverbs 31, the book of Ruth, and Genesis 2. If you want to put a finger in those places, we'll be dancing around with that. All right, let's begin. Begin with a question. If you were to counsel a young man, if a young man comes to you and says he wants to get married, he wants to marry a woman, a young man comes to you and says, I want to marry a woman, what do you say? What kind of woman would you recommend he marry? What attributes are good in a young lady? One word, attributes. Go ahead, shout them out. Anybody have anything that they might suggest this young man look for in his potential bride?
One that loves the Lord.
Somebody who loves the Lord. Okay, that's good. Anything else? Anybody else? Yes? Selfless. Very good. Others? It's okay, there's no wrong answers. Don't be afraid. There will be no quiz. There's no prizes either, but there's no wrong answers. All right. Honesty. Okay, good. I gave you a hint, of course, Proverbs 31 this morning, which is probably somewhat frightening to consider for many ladies. As I look at it, thankfully I'm not a woman, because I don't know that anybody can read this without being overwhelmed and intimidated. Just being honest here, the Proverbs 31 woman is held up as the mark of the perfect woman, the ideal woman, the godly woman, who is obviously the uber woman, the uber wife, and I do think it might be a little unfair to expect all of you ladies to measure up to that. The men certainly don't have their own dedicated chapter, and we get off easy in comparison. Proverbs 31, we have a description of a very special woman, a very special wife. We'll go ahead and we'll just read through it. I'm reading from the NASB. It describes an excellent wife. Starting verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, which is known as Solomon, the son of David. Verse 10, an excellent wife, who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. Some of your translations will say her worth is above rubies, which is very poetic and very nice. Some of your translations will say a worthy wife. Anybody have any other translations out there? Go ahead and shout it out. What does yours say? What kind of wife does your Bible say? Other than excellent. Anybody? Capable. It says capable. A capable wife. Okay. Any others? Anyone else? Virtuous. Okay. We see virtuous a lot. And in some cases you see translations that say valor, or a valorous wife. In Hebrew, the opening line is Eshet Chayil mi yipsa v'rachok mepeninim mikra. In Hebrew, this word Chayil, Eshet Chayil, is what it's saying about an excellent wife or a virtuous wife. In Hebrew, this word Chayil, its usage and its text is most often translated as wealth or strength. And it's often used in militaristic terms, as in a strong army or a strong defense. And there we get the word valor. So what are we talking about here when we think a wife as a woman of valor? If we allow the text to stand on its own behalf, the literary tradition and the intertextuality give some interesting discussions of the Proverbs 31 woman. Solomon was the son of David by Bathsheba. Knowing what we know of the story of Bathsheba, how David saw her bathing in view from the rooftop. Notice that bathing is different in our age than it was then. And notice that Bathsheba had to, thank you. Notice that Bathsheba had to have known her visibility to the king. We have no indications of struggle or rape. We have to conclude that Bathsheba was some kind of willing accomplice to this illicit moment between David and Bathsheba, a kind of affair. You can argue that maybe David acted on his own behalf to put her husband to death. That's a possibility. But it remains that Bathsheba was some kind of willing partner or seductress in this little story. So let's just let that stand. Solomon, who was the next son of Bathsheba and David, would have known something about his mother's history, because we know things about our family, don't we? So Solomon would have known of this story, of this affair, and Uriah probably being put, the fact that David had Bathsheba's previous husband put to death, and so on and so forth. Likely Solomon would have known something about that. So the question stands, was Solomon, the writer of Proverbs 31, was he speaking of his mother Bathsheba? Probably not. I mean, we can kind of conclude that not, because that doesn't sound like it describes. Proverbs 31 doesn't sound like it describes Bathsheba. So there must be something else that Solomon is pointing to. Is he pointing to an ideal? Is he pointing to some myth type, some archetype of the perfect woman? Or is he pointing to somebody that he knows, somebody in culture, somebody in history, somebody in his family that he might have known? So we look at that and we say Solomon, the son of David, David the son of Jesse, Jesse the son of Obed, Obed the son of Boaz by Ruth. And that's interesting. So we arrive at Ruth, Ruth the Moabitess. It turns out that Ruth is the great-great-great-grandmother of Solomon, fourth generation. Depending on the ages here, it's quite possible that Solomon could have known personally his ancestor, Ruth. But more certainly, Ruth was absolutely a legend in the family. The story of Ruth, which merits its place in our canon in the Bible, obviously means that it would have been a story in its time as well. And so certainly would have been known by Solomon. I had a friend in college. She had a grandfather, and this grandfather had prayed as a young man and continued to pray all his life that all his children would be believers in Jesus. He prayed that all of his descendants would be believers. And he grew up and he got married and he had a good number of children. And those children had a good number of children and even a few grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And out of that entire family, which my friend was one of the grandchildren of that grandfather, out of that entire family of nearly 100 at that point, there were only 3 or 4 who were not following the Lord. He had an incredible impact. He had made that level of influence to his entire family. And they looked at him with great respect. And I met some of the family members and heard the stories. And he sounded like he was a very powerful and very profound man in his faith. And he had spent his entire life praying for his entire family. I think that perhaps this is what Ruth was, that level of impact on her family. It's that kind of legacy that perhaps we see here, that generations would have risen up to honor her. And then actually we look at it linguistically. If we linguistically compare the book of Ruth and this Proverbs 31 woman, this Proverbs 31 passage, we find this combination of words, Yeshet Chayil, which in the Hebrew would mean a woman of valor, or a wife of valor, a wife of strength in a militaristic way. We find this phrase, Yeshet Chayil, in the Hebrew twice in the Bible. And those two places are Proverbs 31 and the book of Ruth. So there's a connection there. So we dig a little deeper. And we see this. In Ruth chapter 3, it says this, "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you say, for all the people in the city know you are a woman of excellence," or a Shechayil, a woman of valor. What are we speaking of here? Why would these two passages be connected like this? Let's review the story of Ruth. I'll just tell you the story. You can sit back and just enjoy the narrative. A man named Elimelech in the English, and his wife Naomi are living in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus in several hundred years. But there's a famine, and they leave, and they go to a neighboring country called Moab. Now, Moab was started by a guy named Moab. What do we know about Moab? Moab is the son of the first daughter of Lot, born to Lot's daughter, fathered by Lot. Moab is the incestuous son of Lot. And interestingly enough, that name Moab in the Hebrew means son of the father. So you have this child who's born of this relationship, and you call him what he is, the son of the father. How's that for a kind of curse? So he becomes the father of the Moabites, and they become a very great, kind of semi-powerful nation. Later, when Israel is making their way through the desert, the Moabites are very hostile, and the Moabites come against Israel. And one of the Moabite kings, a fellow named Balak, decides that he's going to hire a pagan prophet named Balaam, and Balaam's going to come and curse the people of Israel. And that's where we get the wonderful children's story of the donkey speaking to Balaam. Balaam is beating the donkey, and the donkey speaks to him. So this man, Balaam, came to curse the Israelites, and he failed at that. So continuing on with this neighboring country of Moab, which is not a friendly place for Israel. Israel was commanded not to intermarry with the Moabites. So later this Elimelech goes to Moab during the famine, and he finds Moabite wives for his two sons. One son is named Mahlon, and the other son is named Chilion. Their names in the Hebrew mean sickness. Mahlon means sickness, and Chilion means destruction or end, the ending. The wife of Mahlon was Ruth, and the wife of Chilion was Orpah. These are Moabite wives. And so what happens is they go on their way, and they're living in Moab. And Elimelech dies, and then Mahlon dies, and Chilion dies. And so we have all the men of this family now have died. And what's left is Naomi, the mother, and the two daughters-in-law. And Naomi goes to her daughters-in-law and says, I'm going to go back home, go back to Bethlehem, and you need to go back to your father's houses. And she says something interesting. She says, I cannot provide sons for you. So in Middle Eastern tradition during those days, and it's also written in the Torah, in the first chapters of the Bible, we have this thing called yibum, or levirate marriage, which is when a man dies and there's no child, his brother will go and father a child in the name of that man. So that man will have a legal son, because it's all about your legacy. It's all about your name living on. And if a man dies without having a son, his name ends. And that's such a terrible thing in that culture and in the Bible, and we can discuss that further. But it's such a terrible thing that God instituted a law whereby the brother must go and father a child, and that child, by the widow of the brother who passed away, and that child becomes the natural legal descendant and heir of that. So what she's saying here, Naomi is saying, is I'm too old to have other sons who will then come into you to provide a son for you. It's the levirate marriage concept. Okay. And so she says, you need to go back to your father's houses, and I'll go back to Bethlehem. Orpah goes back to her father's house. Now, Orpah was married to Chilion, right? And Chilion's name means destruction or end. So Orpah goes back to her father's house, and what happens to the line of Chilion? It ends. It's destruction. It ends. It stops. There's no other people that come from that. No descendants. No offspring. No more stories. But Ruth says this. She says, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. It's one of the shortest and most passionate and powerful lines that remains in Western literature. So she goes back to Bethlehem. They go back to Bethlehem. She starts working in the fields, gleaning and picking up the leftovers from the harvest. And after a time, she meets a fellow named Boaz. In the Middle Eastern cultures and in the Bible, we have this law called the Goel, which is the Redeemer. And what that means is that the Redeemer will redeem or purchase out of slavery or out of bondage or somehow rescue a people. And so Boaz is going to be a redeemer to Naomi and to Ruth. Eventually, Ruth and Boaz get together, and they start fathering children. The first child that is born, though, is given back to Naomi. Naomi is the one who lost her husband, Elimelech. So what happens is the first child goes back to her to replace her dead husband. And now she has a child, because in those cultures, your son is your welfare. Your son is your safety and your security. Your son will provide for you and protect for you when you get older. And so it was a form of welfare to give back. But also, remember, Elimelech died, and his two sons died, so his line died out, like Chilion, and his line died out, so the firstborn son of Naomi goes back to Elimelech and continues that line. And so continues the story of Ruth, and that pretty much sums it up. What is the connection here? The connection here to us, some of the relevance to us, is it's a metaphor for Jesus and what he did for us. He redeems us. He brings about new life for us when our life is at an end, when our life has stopped. Jesus comes in and provides a way for us to be reborn and to continue on. All right. In Ruth chapter 4, we have this scene that you see coming out. And it says this. This is after Boaz and Ruth come together to be married. And all the people who witnessed this, in Ruth chapter 4, verse 11, we have this little phrase. It says, all the people who were in the court, the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, in other words, Ruth, who is coming into your home, into Boaz's home, like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And it says this, may you achieve wealth in the New American Standard Bible. That word wealth there is chayil. May you achieve valor. May valor come into your house. In Ephrathah, be famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, verse 12, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the descendants whom the Lord will give you by this woman. Who are the descendants? Well, the descendants on its face is speaking of course, her son, which is Obed, that son, which is Jesse, and that son was David. And now we get to the line of David, and eventually, if you keep going, you get to the line of Jesus. But what's interesting here in that verse 12, it says, may your house be like the house of Perez, through the descendants whom the Lord will give you, this young woman. The Hebrew word there is hazera, zerah. If you were going to use descendants in like the people who come after me, my children and children's children, in the Hebrew you would use the word toledot, or you might use the word yeladim, children. Why is it using the word zerah here? Well, it's translated as descendants, but zerah actually means seed. Seed. What does that remind us of? Genesis chapter 3. When Adonai is speaking, God is speaking to the serpent, and he says, I will make enemies of you and the woman, of her offspring and her descendants, your offspring and her descendants. What he says there is of your seed and her seed. Who is the seed of Eve? Who is the seed of the woman? It's prophetically pointing to Jesus. So it's interesting that the conclusion of this book of Ruth refers to, moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the seed whom the Lord will give you by this young woman. So if we look at it that way, who is the seed of Ruth and Boaz? It would be Obed, Jesse, David, fast forward all the way to Jesus. So one of the things that I teach is sometimes we read the Bible backwards. You start with Jesus. What do you have to get Jesus? Well, you have to have a mother and a father, and they have to have mothers and fathers. You don't get Jesus without David. You don't get David without Jesse. You don't get David without Obed, and you don't get David without Boaz and Ruth. So Boaz and Ruth have to come together in order for you to get to Jesus. In Genesis chapter 3, where it's speaking of this to the serpent, then God pivots and says to the woman, in pain you will bring forth children. And then it says, I will multiply your pain. What does it mean, multiplied pain? So childbirth, presumably, was a painful experience. That seems to be what it's saying. But why would it say, I will multiply your pain? Because you sinned with the serpent and took from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Genesis. Why is the punishment, I will multiply your pain? Well, maybe it's not a punishment. In pain you bring forth children. Let's assume that that's childbirth. Childbirth is very painful to the woman. It's a profound experience. but it's very painful. But what's more painful for a mother than childbirth? To lose that child. If you were to associate it with a child, I gave birth to my eldest child, what would be the most painful? What would be multiplied pain? To lose that same child. Just put that off to the side for a little bit. Looking at Ruth through the lens of our modern understanding. Who is this Ruth? This Ruth who comes to Bethlehem to bring forth a child to restore the line of Machlon and Elimelech, to redeem their loss and their wandering in the land of Moab. So because of Elimelech's faithlessness, he didn't trust God. During the famine, he went to the neighboring country, which he wasn't supposed to go to. He had his sons intermarry, which he wasn't supposed to do. But because of all that faithlessness, Ruth has come along and has restored and redeemed their loss. Naomi returns to the land as a beggar, having lost her way, seemingly lost control of her inheritance in Israel. But what is restored is when a child is born to her in her old age. And what is this child? It is the child that is brought forth from Ruth. What does this remind us of? Notice that Naomi has returned to the land. She is being provided for by the hard work of Ruth, her daughter Ruth, and by the generosity of Boaz. And so in the story of Ruth, you end up in a place where Ruth is working in the field and they're surviving. Ruth and Naomi are surviving, but you get a sense when you read the story that something stalled. Something needs to happen, or something that has stalled. What has stalled? In the story of Ruth in the second chapter, nothing seems to be happening. She's working in the field. She's bringing home seed. They're surviving. Everything's okay. What has stalled? Well, what has stalled was what needs to happen to bring forth Jesus. Because we don't get Jesus unless we got David. And we don't get David unless we got Jesse. We don't get Jesse unless we got Obed. We don't get Obed, apparently, unless we got Ruth and Boaz. So something's stalled. She's working in the field, but nothing's happening. And then Naomi intervenes to the story of seduction of Boaz by night. And Ruth comes to Boaz and says, place me under your skirts. Metaphorically speaking of like the tents of Israel. Place me under your tents. The Moabite woman being placed under the tents of Israel. However, we can't deny the obvious. It's a rather illicit story. It's a rather graphic story. You've got this drunk farmer who on the night of celebration after finishing the harvest has a little too much to drink, and he goes and lays down on the other side of the grain pile. That's literally what happened. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and there's a young lady tucked under his robes. Sorry, it is what it is, folks. It's a seduction story. But there's nothing illicit that happens. And Boaz says something to her. He says to her, your last kindness is greater than your first kindness. So what was Ruth's first kindness? What was Ruth's first kindness? Her first kindness was taking care of Naomi. Her first kindness was, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. That kindness to return. So what is the last kindness? That she accepted Boaz as an aging man? That she was willing to connect herself to Boaz? I would read this as the last kindness was that she gave herself to the requirements of this long narrative of human history. The greatest point of human history, the narrative of human history, the greatest point is the birth of Jesus and his sacrifice. We don't get Jesus. Ruth is the one who comes in and steps in the gap to make that happen, to make sure that's going to happen. That kindness also is to redeem the house of Boaz, because there was something absolutely necessary about Boaz. Boaz is part of this lineage as well. When you read the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, I believe, you see Boaz is in there. So Ruth rescues the line and the purpose of Boaz at this point, the line and the purpose of Ruth and Boaz being Jesus, of course. But there's something else that the book of Ruth speaks to. It is the bringing of children, the redemption of a line that has stalled. Like we said, Kilian means end. Orpah did not return with Ruth. Therefore, that line has ended. So, what is the agenda of the enemy today vis-a-vis Christianity, the people of God, the kingdom of God? What is the enemy's purpose? Does he mess with you? Does he tempt you? Does he distract you? Does he attack you? Yes. Yeah, those are all part of his purpose. But what's his overlying agenda? What does he really want to accomplish? He wants to wipe it out. Why does he want to wipe it out? Because every one of you is producing fruit. Every one of you is producing more descendants. Every one of you is producing more children of the kingdom. And the enemy needs to wipe you out so you don't produce more. He wants to stall the kingdom of God. Such that all of you in this place, imagine if you were somehow, through attack, through distraction, through sin, through failure, through whatever famine means, imagine if all of you ceased to have any fruit. Imagine if all of you ceased to bring anybody further into the kingdom. You would all have stalled on this day. And if that stall remains, we age and we die, and that's the end of it. What is the purpose of Israel, of the Jews? The purpose of Israel, the Jews, is to reveal Jesus. To reveal Jesus to all the earth. To bring forth and reveal the Messiah. How is the Messiah, how is Jesus revealed in our days? He's revealed through us. Through the birth and the born again of people. When we come to Jesus, we become brides to him in order to bring about more descendants, more children of him. In a sense, right, Ruth goes and she provides a son to this line that had stalled. And she restarts the line. What is our purpose? Our purpose is also to bring forth new believers, to bring forth born again. In the same way that Ruth gave birth to a child, we help give birth through the born again of a new person, a new believer in Jesus. How do we do this? We do this by our testimony of the gospel of Jesus. Okay, so let's return back to this discussion of Ruth in Proverbs 31. Looking at this perhaps not just as an indication of Ruth, but also as the future bride of Messiah, of Jesus. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at Proverbs 31 now. And as you look at it, I'd like you to read it a little differently. In Genesis chapter 2, we have this moment where God says there's no suitable companion. A suitable companion for Adam was not found. And so it goes along and it describes a narrative by which you have this grand beauty pageant of all the animals coming before Adam, and none of them are found to be suitable companions. And so God takes a rib from the side of Adam and brings forth a woman. This is Eve. Adam looks at her and says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. But in this narrative, it talks about the suitable companion. The Hebrew there is ezer kenegdo, ezer, helper. Some of you are familiar with the Ebenezer. We have that in some of our hymns, referring to the stone of help. It's using the same word, ezer. And that means helper. The word kenegdo, though, means face to face. It means a suitable companion to my face. It means a companion or a helper who's helping me face to face. When the Bible describes us as the bride of the bridegroom, the bride of Messiah, the bride of Christ, what does that mean? It means that we must be, in the terms of the Bible, a suitable companion. We must somehow be a suitable helper. we must somehow be a helper to his face in order for us to be a bride in the way the Bible describes a bride. So, considering all these things, let's look at Proverbs 31. An excellent wife who can find, her worth is far above rubies. What if this is a commentary on the bride? What if this is a commentary on believers in Jesus? Now, what does it mean to say that the wife needs to be a valorous bride? She needs to be a woman of valor. Valor is militaristic strength. Do we have an aspect of our belief in Jesus that requires us to have a militaristic strength? If you read the New Testament, you read Paul's writings, you see him referring to put on the whole armor of God. You see him referring to all this language and all these things in almost a militaristic sense. We certainly don't do battle, physical hand-to-hand combat with either the enemy or our non-believing neighbors. But we are, in a militaristic sense, a companion, a suitable companion, a face-to-face helper as the bride. And so in that sense, yes, this first line of the Proverbs 31 woman is indeed applicable. An excellent wife, or a valorous wife, a woman of valor who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. Your value, first of all, your value that commanded the price of the death sacrifice of Jesus is incredible. But now that you have become his bride, the bride to the bridegroom, do you think your value has diminished? By no means, it's increased. Your value is far above rubies. Your value is the cost of his sacrifice plus. It is additional to the cost of his sacrifice because you're not just somebody that's been bought, paid for, and released. That'd be like going to the zoo and buying the tiger from the zoo and taking him and releasing him into the wild. You have not been released into the wild. Rather, you've been purchased by his blood sacrifice. Why? To become his bride. Your worth is far above rubies. Continuing on. The heart of the husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Does Adonai God trust in us? Does Yeshua the King trust in us? Well, I should say, he's entrusted to us the gospel. He's entrusted to us the testimony. He's entrusted to us our family, our friends, our neighbors. Every relationship you have is a sacred trust that God is allowing so that you can be an impact to that person. Yes, I dare say, those of you who have children, God has entrusted you to steward those children. Continuing on. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Verse 17. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. What does the Bible say? Be strong in the power of his might. Right? We are exhorted to be strong in what God has given us. We are exhorted to be strong in the word, strong in doing good. Continuing on. She senses that her grain is good. Her lamp does not go out at night. Her lamp does not go out at night. Is there a sense in which we, as the bride to the bridegroom, we as the bride of Jesus, is there a sense in which our lamp should not go out? By all means. You are the light of the world. Continuing on. Verse 20, she extends her hand to the poor and she stretches out her hands to the needy. Do we do this? Yes, absolutely. This is absolutely speaking of this. She's not afraid of the snow. She makes coverings for herself. All her household are clothed with scarlet. Verse 22, she makes coverings for herself. Verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. Is there a sense in which Jesus, the bridegroom, is known? In the gates is a reference to the place where people would make decisions, where you come and have things judged. It's like the council of the town who runs the town, the elders in the town. They would sit at the gate and they would make decisions in the gates. It's speaking here of Boaz also, who did this little arrangement for Ruth to become her redeemer, her rescuer. It's speaking of that, but it's also speaking of Jesus, who is absolutely in the court of heaven in a position of authority. Continuing on, verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. In what way do we smile at the future? We have promises that are coming. We have a hope. We have assurance. We've read the end of the book. Is the world full of chaos? Is the world full of uncertainty? My goodness, in the last 3 weeks, what have we had? We had a presidential candidate drop out. We had a miserable debate performance. We had an attempted assassination. We have attacks on major railway lines and other infrastructure in France for the Olympics. We have debauchery in the Olympic ceremonies. We have profound chaos around the world, not to mention what's going on in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. We have profound chaos all around the world. Can you smile at the future? As the bride of Messiah, as the bride of Jesus, yes, you can. How so? How can you smile at the future? Because you know what's coming. What is the message that you give people, neighbors, friends, and family with all the turmoil in the world? It ought to be a message of peace. It ought to be a message of hope. You ought to smile. You smile at the days to come because God is in charge and God is good. And we could go in and we could spend quite a bit of time discussing each of these and how they apply to Ruth and how they apply to us. But skipping down, she does not eat the bread of idleness. What is it we're commanded to do without ceasing? Pray. She doesn't eat the bread of idleness. She's not idle. She is unceasing in prayer. Isn't that supposed to be us as the bride of Jesus? And then it says this, her children rise up and bless her, her husband also, and he praises her, saying, many daughters have done nobly, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the products of her hand. Let her works praise her in the gates. If you're wise, you won't exalt yourself. You won't trumpet your own victories. You'll let other people trumpet those victories. And what would be the greatest accolade? If all of you were to come to my memorial service, what would be the greatest thing that I could hope that you could hear said on that day? Well, hopefully it would be some testimonies of how I did good things, that I was a blessing, that I brought people to Jesus. I would hope that would be the story, the narrative that people would tell. Yeah, my works will praise. Not my name, not my reputation, not my eloquence or my knowledge, my training, my positions. None of that will bring me praise. Let the works I do, let the service and the sacrifice bring praise. And all of this in the context of what? The submission to Jesus as a bridegroom. The submission to the husband Jesus in this dynamic that we have here. All right. So what does this mean to all of us if we are the valorous wife, the bride of Jesus? We eagerly serve and labor in the kingdom. What is our labor? Our labor is service and sacrifice. It's good deeds. It's the testimony, the gospel of Jesus, but it's also the ministry of intercession. What is this intercession we do? This intercession are the prayers that we offer up for people around us. What is the essence of prayer? What is it that we're actually doing when we pray? We're talking to God, okay? Just telling him things? Kind of telling him things. He already knows about it, right? But why are we telling him things? There's one teaching that says that prayer is for us, so that we get to be involved in this transaction. But considering everything I've said today about the suitable companion, the helper to my face, Now apply that understanding to your relationship with God in prayer. Now, what is prayer? Prayer is a form of you helping God. And I know that's going to blow your minds theologically because we can't help God, right? But in a sense, isn't that what I'm doing? Oh, by the way, God, I need you to remember this person. I'm helping you. It'd be like the husband who's going out the door, and he knows he needs to go to the grocery store and get milk on his way home. And the wife says to him, I need you to get milk on the way home. Right? We see that happen all the time. She's helping him remember. Does it mean that he didn't remember? Well, he may have forgotten. He may not have forgotten. Of course, God doesn't forget. But there's nothing wrong with the wife saying, oh, by the way, I need you to get milk. Or how about this? The husband's going out the door, and the wife says, before you leave, I want to talk to you about our son. I want to talk to you about our daughter. And he says, I know about our son. I know about our daughter. What do you have to tell me? And she tells him. She shares with him. She connects with him what she feels and what she needs and what she knows. Now, the husband may know everything already. Isn't that the essence of prayer? In prayer, Adonai knows. If you're praying for somebody, if you're praying for a brother or a sister or a neighbor or friend or family member, God knows. You're not telling him something he doesn't already know. But you are functioning, as we've talked this morning, that helper role, the face-to-face helper role, saying, I want you to know something. I'm going to help you. And that's what God has instituted for us. Not because he needs our help, but because he wants us to be that level of intimate. He wants it to be that level of sharing. If I were to tell the lawn guy to remember to trim the shrubs, that's just delegating. I don't delegate to God. What do? I connect with him. I share. That's what the Ezer is. That's what the helper is. It's connecting with God. When my son was very little, he used to like to help me, which meant that every job I did took 10 times longer than it should have. Isn't that a little bit like God? But I let my son help me. Why? Because I wanted him to experience it. Did I need him? No. Did I enjoy him? Absolutely. So God, in all of your ignorance, in all of your clumsiness, in all of your awkwardness, as you come to him in your prayers, telling him things, and he knows 10 million variables around what you're praying for. You're praying for so-and-so to get this job that they really need, and God knows it's a bad job. But he knows all that. He's patient with our ignorance. He takes delight in us meeting him in that place to be a helper. The same way I took delight in my son helping me. But also I wanted my son to experience helping me because he would learn from it, he would connect with me, he would grow. It was just a good thing on all levels. That's what God is doing for us when we come to him with our prayers. We are that helper. Our child, the one we love, in a sense. If my wife comes to me to talk to me about our son or our daughter, and she says to me, our child, the one we both love, I need you to understand. Sometimes my wife might say, we need to be more patient. We need to be more generous. We need to be more loving. We need to be more kind. Or sometimes the wife says, we need to be more severe. We need to be more firm, right? Sometimes the husbands are teddy bears, especially with their daughters. Sometimes it's the wife who comes along and says, no, you're letting her get off with this. We have to talk about this. In a sense, that's how we are with God. We come to him to share with him. Where does this language of helping God come from? It comes from Genesis chapter 2. Remember the suitable companion. So looking at this again, chapter 31 description of the woman of valor, and let's apply it now, not just to the wife, but let's apply it to the wife who is praying. The bride who is praying, the praying bride. And let's look through the text again. Chapter 31, verse 10. An excellent or valorous wife, who can find? Her worth is above rubies. What does Adonai value? What does God value? He values a wife who is valorous in prayer. What does it mean to be valorous in prayer? It's to fight in prayer. It's to wrestle in prayer. The word Israel means to wrestle with God. Israel's task, their purpose on this earth was to grapple and wrestle with God. Remember when Moses said, unless you go up with us, I won't go any further. In response to God saying, I'm going to kill all them and start over with you. To which Moses responded, unless you go with us, I won't go any further. So we got a standoff here, right? We got a showdown. Moses is acting like a wife. He's saying, no, I refuse to do this. He's wrestling with God. That wrestling with God takes its character as valorous. There are times that we have to fight in prayer. There are times that we have to fight for our children. We have to fight for our parents. We have to fight for health. We have to fight for our schools in prayer. We have to do the heavy lifting of prayer. And so on. It goes on. And all these areas are battlegrounds. All these areas are battlegrounds. Continuing on through this chapter 31, consider doing good and not evil in your prayers. Not giving in to idleness in your prayers, girding yourself in strength in your prayers. Consider all these things with the role of the bride to the bridegroom as the helper. This is where we fight. This is where we live and breathe. This is our interaction point with God. It's a point of prayer. It's a point of connecting to Him. May you be inspired in your place as the bride of Messiah, the bride of Jesus, the bride of the bridegroom. May you be inspired by Ruth. May you be inspired by the Proverbs 31 as the community of saints who are becoming suitable companion to Jesus. And the last thing I would say is everything that I've talked about this morning, in one sense, you think of it individually. I imagine most of you have considered what I've said from an individual perspective. Like, what am I? Am I the suitable companion? I'm the one who intercedes. But understand that in the kingdom of God, we're seen as individuals, but we're also equally seen as communities. And it's the entire community, the entire kingdom of God that is seen, but it's also congregations that are seen. So you, Grace Bible Church, you have a purpose. You have a purpose to be valorous in these days. All of you, this congregation, this church, this building was appointed and built up to this place, and these people have gathered and become this congregation. Why? For a purpose in time. To be valorous in this time. To be not idle in this time. To be a helper to God face to face in this time. What does it mean to be a congregation that's helping God face to face? It means you pray. That's your work. That's your heavy lifting in the kingdom. May you find yourself as a congregation and as individuals, suitable companion to Jesus, as a helper in His intercession. Because Jesus is the one who's always interceding, right? It says in the text that Hebrews 7, it says in the text that He's always interceding. So we join Him in His intercedings. We partner with Him in interceding before the Father. This Proverbs 31 woman is not just a way of identifying a godly woman and a wife, but I would suggest it is more, and rather a way of identifying the church, the bridegroom, the bride to the bridegroom in our day. May we all be inspired to step further into the favor and grace of God, to become the fullness of what it would mean, a valorous bride, a bride of valor, a woman of valor. Thank you.